Jonathan Haidt, it is so great to have you here. You seemingly are everywhere. The Anxious Generation, The Great Rewiring, most talked about book on social media. As I walk around New York, I see everyone carrying it around, whether it's traditional media, podcasts, politicians, psychologists, sociologists. I'm seeing you, the pictures of you with Oprah, Tom Hanks, Kim Kardashian. Jonathan, how is it going?
Well, from a book promotional point of view, I guess I'd say amazingly well. I can't believe this. So it's two things. One is that I have an amazing promotional team, just because lots of people care a lot about this issue. And then they come and they say, how can I help? How can I help? And so, for example, Jessica Seinfeld, Jerry's wife, is really concerned about this issue. And she has been just amazingly helpful in helping me meet people and in supporting the book and the project. Penguin Press has been great. My publicist, Gail Brussel. But, it's like you can put things out there. But what seems to be happening is all over the developed world, parents are having the same struggle. All over the developed world, parenthood has become a constant struggle over screen time. Very few people are managing it well. And everyone's sick of it. Everyone's like, something's really wrong here. And the scientific community has not yet spoken with a clear voice to say, yes, this is bad. Now, I'm in a debate. I mean, we'll work it out, but I'm coming out and saying, I think the evidence is clear enough, and the cost of acting, the cost of putting in the reforms is so minimal that, I kind of think that we should, not have our kids have a phone-based childhood. And that message is just resonating all over the world because everyone is sick of it. Everyone is ready to change.
Yeah, you're really hitting at the core of how everyone's feeling. I saw that you recently said you've compared 2024 for social media in the same way 1989 was for Soviet communism. And you see it having an imminent change here, a very quick change. Why do you see that, and explain that comparison to me?
So, I'm a social scientist. I'm a social psychologist, which means I'm especially interested in the way that people affect each other and in the kind of emergent dynamics, the things that come out when you have a community and different social forces. So I used to love to travel by myself. I did all kinds of solo trips around the world. And in 1987, I did a trip across the East Bloc. I went to Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And what I saw there was a region that used to be vibrant and intellectual, before the Second World War. I saw a region where, especially in Romania, everyone is poor and dirty. They don't have soap. They don't have much electricity. Everyone hates Ceausescu. Nobody's a communist, but it's kept in place by fear. And so when you have a system kept in place by fear and everybody wants to change, but they're afraid to be the first mover, because if you're the first mover, you get taken away by the secret police. Well, when you finally do get the protesters in Berlin, you finally do get the Berlin Wall falling, the rest of the dominoes fall within a year or two. So that was the most extraordinary example of social change that we've ever seen. Now, this is a little different. It's not as though everyone is kept in place by fear, although in a sense they are. The fear of missing out is what's keeping everybody hooked. And so the key thing here is that this is not like the grown-ups saying, oh, kids, we're going to take away your social media and your smartphones. And the kids are, no, we love our social media and smartphone. No, that's not what's happening. What's happening is you talk to Gen Z, especially the older members, 10-year-olds, they desperately want TikTok and Instagram and a smartphone. But you talk to the 20-year-olds. I can't find a 20-year-old or 25-year-old who says, yeah, you know what? I think social media is good for kids. I cannot find that, like not a one. So, Gen Z, when you put the question to them, they don't want to be the only one off. But if you say, how about if everybody was off? They say, oh, yeah, that would be great. So, yeah. So, my point is just that when everyone's ready to change and then you have a sort of a clear direction of change, boom, it goes fast, just like the fall of the Berlin Wall.
So what's the Berlin Wall in this scenario?
Well, the Berlin Wall was maintained by the threat of Soviet violence and their secret police forces, and everyone was afraid of that. And in this case, I think the equivalent, it's a loose equivalent, but I think the equivalent is nobody wants to be the mom who says, well, I know all your friends have a smartphone, dear. I know you're 12 years old and everyone else is on Instagram and that's where all the action is, but you're not going to be on. No one wants to be that mom. Now, some people have the guts to be that mom. But if you're the only one doing it, you are imposing a cost on your child. Now, in the long run, it's very likely good for your child. But in the short run, you're imposing a lot of suffering on your child. So it's the fear for the young people. It's the fear of missing out that is paralyzing. They desperately, even though they know it's bad for them, they say, "Look, I don't care. I really don't want to be ostracized." That's the most important thing to a teenager. And for the parents, it's the fear of their kids being ostracized. And I'm trying to wipe that out by saying, this is a collective action problem. Yes, it's hard to do if you're on your own. But you know what? Team up with the parents of you're probably on a text thread with the parents of your kids' friends anyway. Just say, hey, I want to do this. Are you in? If we all do this together? And then it becomes much easier.
It's funny, the way you address it there is similar to what you see on a national corporate level. In some cases, you see companies going to the U.S. government saying, can you please police us? Because if I make a decision, you hear this with the airlines, you hear this with the tech companies saying, regulate us so we all have to play by the same rules.
Exactly. There's a very useful phrase, a race to the bottom. And or you can think of an arms race. In an arms race, you have to spend a lot more money on weapons because the other guy is. And if there was a way to put a cap on it, you'd all be better off. In the same way, we're seeing a race to the bottom. Tristan Harris calls it a race to the bottom of the brainstem. So if one company treats their kids respectfully and doesn't try to addict them, but then another company says, screw that. We're going for the quick dopamine. We're A/B testing all the different ways, what keeps them on longer. We're going to go deeper down into the brainstem, hit their autonomic reactions. That company wins. And in a competitive environment, the company that treats the kids well goes out of business, whereas the one that just goes right down to the bottom of the brainstem, they win. And the main way out of that is regulation. That's why one of the main functions of government in human history is to solve collective action problems, to help us live together in ways where there's a common floor, common set of rules of the road, and then you unleash free enterprise and you get amazing results. But if you have a capitalist free market system with very poor regulation, you get a lot of exploitation.
So that's a bit of the solution. I want to get to the solution in a little bit, but first I want to discuss the problem here. And admittedly, I want to say I first started to learn about your work with your Atlantic piece a few years ago, why the past 10 years of American life have been uniquely stupid. I love that title. And I just want you to know I've shared that article with with my audience multiple times. That got into a bit of the politics, but also the impact that technology has been having on us. You start to identify the early teens as the problem. How did that set the table for the book here, and how does your book go further from that?
Yeah. So the key thing here is that I'm a social psychologist who studies morality. That's what I did for my dissertation at the University of Pennsylvania in the early 90s. I study how morality varies across cultures. I have studied some developmental psychology, like moral development, but I'm not an expert in teen mental health per se. But I think what I brought into this was a social psychology perspective on how is everybody influencing everybody else, because that's the secret of the trap. And so the story that I tell in the book, which I worked at with Zach Rausch, my research partner, the story we tell in the book, let me walk you through it, because once you understand the technology story, and especially if a lot of your listeners are in their 30s, they'll remember a lot of this. So our story begins, before the 90s, everyone went outside and played. I grew up in the 70s. There was a huge crime wave. There were drugs everywhere. There were drunk drivers, but all kids went out and played. Obviously, kids have to play. They all go out and play. And then in the 90s, we freak out. We think all our kids are going to be abducted if we ever let them out of our sight. So we start bringing our kids in. And at the same time, the internet comes in. And the early internet, the internet that the millennials grew up with, was amazing. It was Web 1. There was no way to do money. It was just you put stuff up, you find stuff. That's it. It was
I remember it well. I was born in 82. Officially, I think they call us elder millennials.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
I still had to go to the library in high school, John, to look up an article about a country because the internet wasn't wasn't there yet. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. So if you can imagine, I remember because I was in my 30s when the internet came out in the 90s, and for all of human history, if you'd said to people, "Would you like omniscience? Would you like to know everything for free instantly?" Everybody would assume, well, that's God. That's a godlike power. Yeah, sure, I'd love that. And I'll never forget in 1994 when somebody showed me, I think it was Alta Vista, was one of the early web browsers. It was like God was in my computer. Like, how do they do this? Anything I want to know instantly? What the hell is going on here? And so the millennials, you guys, and you didn't just learn how to use the web. Like your generation, you learned how to build computers, take apart computers, motherboards, memory, so you guys were
we
learning.
put in a new CD-ROM drive. We were taking apart our computers
Exactly.
to try to get them to move slightly quicker. Yeah,
that's right. So you were learning. You guys were learning about computers. You learned to program. You learned HTML. So the internet was amazing for you guys. And guess what? Your mental health as a millennials was actually better than your older siblings in Gen X. Gen X had the worst mental health of any generation. I think that's because they were the most lead poisoned, but that's another story. We banned leaded gas around 1980, 81, and about 15 years later, crime drops, suicide drops, all sorts of things go down. Anyway, sorry, that's just an interesting aside. So the 90s is the golden age, democracy is breaking out all over the world. And the internet is going to help that. We're all so optimistic about the internet. And your mental health was actually getting a little better. All right, so everything's fine until around 2010. And here's what happens in very rapid succession. So social media really comes out as we know it 2004, but it was like Facebook, MySpace, Friendster. You put up your page. These were called social networking systems, SNS, because it's just about I connect with you, you connect with him, we like the same band. That's harmless. But in 2009, you get the like button and the retweet button, and suddenly Meta or Facebook and other platforms, they have so much information about you that they can algorithmicize everything. They already had the news feed. So originally, it was like, I connect with you, hey, what's up? And then it's all about this giant river of newsfeed coming at me, chosen by algorithm, a lot of stuff to make me angry. So the internet is changing, social media is changing. But here's the key thing. In 2010, do you remember when you got your first smartphone? What year was it? The iPhone comes out in 2007. When did you get it?
I was for work purposes as a journalist, I had a BlackBerry in the mid 2000s. And ultimately, the apps were super slow. You couldn't really engage on it. And you used like BlackBerry BBM to like message friends and like your existing social network. My first iPhone, I probably wait a little bit. I think 2010, 2011.
So that's the key thing. So the iPhone comes out in 2007. It's very expensive. It's pretty cool. I got one in 2008, but there's no app store. There's no push notifications. So it's just an amazing digital Swiss Army knife. I still love my iPhone. I mean, the thing has a flashlight on it, so it's an amazing digital Swiss Army knife. But in 2010, young people all have flip phones. Very few have a smartphone. In the beginning of 2010, there's no front-facing camera. There's no Instagram. Very few people have high-speed data or high-speed internet. So it was, as you said, with the BlackBerry, like it's slow. So all you really do is text. You're communicating, and that's good. There's nothing wrong with texting your friends. But by 2015, almost all teens have a smartphone with a front-facing camera, Instagram, because Facebook buys Instagram in 2012, and that really is what makes it blow up. Everyone's got high-speed internet. So now everything, you got video, you've got constant notifications coming in. In 2010, the iPhone was still your servant. It was a tool. It was like a Swiss Army knife. By 2015, for a lot of kids, it was their master. It governs their day. Constant notifications, constant distraction. My students at NYU, I teach a course on flourishing. They have almost no attention. They have almost no ability to do anything because the phone dominates everything about their day. And once I show them that and they get off, then they have these amazing discoveries like, hey, I can pay attention.
So we talk about this uniquely stupid decade, right? And unfortunately, kids born after 1995 are coming of age during that time. Yep. You talk a lot. You have an amazing amount of scientific data, charts, et cetera, in your book. You talk about the frontal cortex rewiring during puberty, that effectively in this moment where this amazing amount of technology is coming in, but now it sounds the way you're describing it, like it's the four horsemen of the apocalypse are coming in between the like button, et cetera. Why that's such a key period of time here for the brain and this technology, why that mix is so toxic?
So human childhood is really a miracle. We have these gigantic brains that are so big that we can't even have gestation until they're done. No other animal comes out so helpless. I mean, no other mammal, obviously kangaroos do, but no other mammal comes out so helpless. Other animals, they're born, they can run that day. But humans, we pop out about 3 months premature. We should be born after 12 months gestation, but the female hip can't accommodate. Anyway, it's a long story. But you have to see the brain as just kind of the beginning. Like the genes create the brain as this like thing that has so much more development to go. That's why our childhood is so long. And everybody who's a parent, you've seen the way like first it's all about walking, and then it becomes all about talking. And then, you see it's like different parts of the brain are wiring up as the kid is doing a lot of trial and error in the world. And they'll do things over and over and over again. And that's how they're doing that to wire up their brain. So that's all the lower level stuff. All right. So now we get to puberty. Puberty is an incredibly rapid period of brain rewiring. Like the first couple years of life are too, but at puberty, you get obviously a huge increase in body growth, but you also get a huge increase in brain rewiring into the adult pattern. And that means that the brain isn't growing. The brain is already almost full size by age 6, but the brain is filtering out what are the connections that weren't necessary. Let's get rid of those. It's putting myelin down on the axons to make circuits faster. So a lot of this is happening during puberty. And this is not basic stuff like walking and talking. This is really subtle stuff like, who am I? What's my relationship to my peers, to adults, to God? All this higher level cognition, stuff about identity. All of this is happening during puberty. And for all of human history, adults thought that they had some responsibility to help guide kids through it. And so, adults play a big role in kids' lives, and they show them the right way to be. Of course, there's some struggle, and the kids want to be deviant sometimes. But basically, puberty, you need the help of your culture to get through it. And, in the Jewish religion, you have Torah study for several years, and then you're bar mitzvah, and then, you're treated as an adult. You're not an adult, but you're treated as one in some way. So if you see puberty as this long and difficult passageway of cultural development, you become a competent adult in your culture. Now, imagine in 2010, you just shred all. You say, to hell with that. Let's get rid of all of that. Let's just give our kids phones and Instagram and YouTube and later TikTok. Let's just have them spend 5 hours a day. That is literally the average. 5 hours a day is what our kids now spend just on social media. And that's mostly the short videos. Those things are very powerful socializing agents. So if we said, how about if the grown-ups in the previous generation, how about if we just step back? We have no role in raising our kids. Let's let the internet do it. And not just the random internet. Let's let the internet as chosen by Meta and TikTok and their algorithms, let's let them do it. So if my kid ever expresses any interest in dieting, before you know it, she's going to get eating disorder stuff. Or if my kid is a little anxious, before you know it, he's going to be pulled into some influencer group where the more anxious you are, the more support you get. This is insanity. This is completely nuts.
You compare it. You compare it. I love this metaphor that giving them smartphones and social media is the equivalent of letting your children in the real world walk through a unsupervised through a bad part of town or a war zone.
Yeah, that's right. So, what I'm basically saying, I can summarize the whole book by saying we have overprotected our children in the real world, and we have underprotected them online. And I usually get the question, wait, isn't that contradictory? Isn't that a paradox? How can you say we should be more protective in one place and less in another? And I'm like, wait a sec. Why is this paradoxical? Imagine if your house was at the edge of the forest. And if you go out the front door, you go into this beautiful meadow, and it goes on and on for a long time. And there are bunny rabbits and occasionally deer in the meadow. But if you go out the back door, you go into a big, thick woods where there are lions and tigers and bears and snakes. And what if in 2010 we said to our kids, don't go out the front door. It's too dangerous. You might get bitten by a bunny rabbit. But go out the back door. Go play in the woods. And, 10% of you will get addicted. A number of you will get sex-torted. Some of you will commit suicide. But, it's the internet. That's what everyone's doing. I would venture to say that if that was your parenting philosophy, you should probably be less protective about the meadow and more protective about the woods. That's all I'm saying.
You say that, the end of the world didn't start with the iPhone. That, you go back to the 80s here, and you've been, you've been mentioning it here. The in the book, you have some charts also showing the irony that the number of hours parents spent with their kids actually goes up in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, that's right.
Unsupervised play goes down. Parents have less kids, so you become more obsessed with the kids that you do have. And we create this culture where we're preventing necessary things, getting hurt, exclusion, losing. Talk to me about that. I'm the parent. I'm a new parent of a 9-month-old, our first.
Oh, good. Congratulations.
And these are thank you. And these are the discussions that, we're having as two millennial parents about how to raise them, and the difficulty of I want to keep my child safe, but there's these necessary things kids need to experience.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. So of course, as a parent, your job is safety, but always keep in mind that they have an incredible hunger and need for experience. And so here I'm following my muse, Lenore Skenazy, a wonderful woman who wrote a book called Free Range Kids. Every parent should read it. It really changed the way my wife and I raised our kids. Free range kids. And Lenore says, of course, you don't want your kids to get physically hurt, like wearing a helmet when they ride a bicycle. That's good. But saying you can't ride a bicycle because you might get hurt, now you're depriving them of experience. If you keep doing that, before you know it, you have a kid who has never really grown up and is not able to function as an adult. And that's what we started seeing in 2014 and 2015 on college campuses. The students coming in, we thought they were millennials back then. We thought the millennial generation ended in the year 2000 is what the demographers just guessed. But it turns out it doesn't. The millennial generation ends in 1995. The kids who were born in 96, 97, they arrived on campus much less able to cope, much more vulnerable, much more fragile. Some of them asked for trigger warnings, safe spaces. And this is all about words. This is about literature. This is not about people screaming racial epithets. This is like Shakespeare. Really? You need a trigger warning for Shakespeare? We couldn't understand.
Ideas have become harmful to this generation.
Exactly. That's right. So, as we say in the Coddling the American Mind, the job of a parent is to work him or herself out of a job. Your job is to get to the point, certainly by the age of 18, when your kid can go off and live without you. And that's the way it used to be. Now, in some sense, childhood has been lengthening for 100 years. 100 years ago, kids got married when they were 15 or 16. So some of this is just normal cultural evolution.
My grandmother in Morocco learned to trade when she was 9 and was already sewing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. My parents grew up in the Depression. I mean, things moved faster back then. So part of this is okay. Just life is childhood is lengthening. That's fine. But an 18-year-old now has the life experience of a 14-year-old from 30 years ago, because it used to be that everyone was let out between the age of 6 and 8. I've done this poll all over the country. When were you let out? And everybody who was born before 1980 says 6, 7, or 8. So first, second, or third grade. Everyone's out playing. But now you ask Gen Z, and the answer is usually 10, 11, or 12. So we literally don't let them we don't let them taste independence until they're already, getting into puberty. And I think in some sense it's too late. I mean, I don't mean to say that. I mean, you can, there's still a lot you can do, even for a kid in his 20s. You can still help them change their habits. I don't want to be too fatalistic about this, but puberty is a really sensitive period. And if you give your kids the right kinds of experiences with a lot of gradually increasing independence and where they learn from their mistakes, by the time they're 18, you've got an adult on your hands. You've got a young adult on your hands. Whereas if you're always there for them, you're always there to fix the problems. Oh, you forgot your backpack and your lunch? I'll drive to school. I'll bring you your lunch. If you're always there to fix the problems, they don't develop that independence. They don't learn from experience. So yes, keep your kids safe from concussions, but don't keep your kids safe from experiences that will expand their repertoire, their abilities.
Though speaking of concussions, you actually have some interesting data in there on the number of injuries kids are experiencing that, typically one would assume teenage boys should be, have a pretty high rate in the ER. And you talk about how that's changed because they're spending a lot of time in the basement on their phones or on video games.
Yeah, this is the most surprising graph in the book. This is one that a lot of people ask me about. So, we show in the book how childhood changed, how Gen Z is much more risk averse. Now, that's on surveys. They say they're more risk averse. Does that mean they really are more risk averse, or is it just what they say? Well, we found data. So the CDC, they track very carefully why people are admitted to hospitals because they need to know if there's some big surge of something, like maybe it's a new disease. So one of the categories is fractures, broken bones. And it even goes down, like broken arms. And what you see is that before 2010, one group stands out. from all the others. You break down the data by boy versus girl, men versus women. You break it down by age. And what you see is that, yeah, teenage boys, they're the ones who are mostly breaking their arms. And, you know, when you were a kid, probably too, you rode your bicycle, you made jump ramps, you have your little sister lie down under the ramp and then you ride your bicycle over her, that sort of thing. And it was exciting. That's the key thing. Kids need thrills. They need a little bit of fear. They need a little bit of danger. And then that's how they learn to overcome their fears. So
right, even at the playground, we had much more dangerous equipment that we could play on.
That's right. Because if you can get hurt on the playground, then every day you're learning how to not get hurt. Whereas if you grow up with everything bubble wrapped, it's boring and you don't learn how to not get hurt. And then you show up at college and you're hurt by Shakespeare. So we really did a number on our kids by overprotecting them. I feel like I dropped a thread of something you asked. What was the last? Oh, the fractures. Yes, I'm sorry. Let me finish up. The broken arms. So the CDC tracks reasons for hospitalization. And by 2010, it's teenage boys and then young men in their 20s are basically the same. Very high levels of broken arms. All the other groups, very low levels of broken arms. And then you look at these graphs from 2010 through about 2020. And all the other groups, they go down a little bit. Like we're getting safer, you know, there's not as many broken arms, go down a little bit. But the boys are plummeting. They are dropping so fast in the 2010s. They used to be the most likely to break their arms. Now they are the least likely of all males. So a boy today, a 15-year-old boy today, is less likely than his father or his grandfather today to break an arm. It's a small difference, but it is literally the least because they don't do anything that could lead to a broken arm. Video games and pornography, I mean, you know, you're using your arms, but there's no way to break them.
That leads me to the question, and you get into the gender difference here of how all of this has impacted growing boys and growing girls. And you talked a bit about boys there, but how are their brains reacting differently here? Because among the data you're seeing is just the stark nature of what's happening to young girls.
That's right. Good. Now, I'm glad you asked me that because I've changed my thinking a little bit recently. I used to always say that social media is much worse for girls, and it is. But it made it sound like it's really the girls who are suffering. And now I'm changing my mind on this. So first, think about how you trap an animal. If you want to trap an animal, you have to use bait that will appeal to the animal. You don't want to lure a fish. You don't want to lure a cat into a trap with an apple. Like they don't care about apples. You have to have something that is attractive. And then you have to have a way so that once they get the bait, they can't leave. That's what a trap is. So if you want to trap girls, if you're a social media company in 2012 and you want to trap girls better than other companies are trapping girls, what do? The bait is social relationships. Do you want to hear what Maria said about Julia? Like, that's really, really interesting to teenage girls. Do you want to see a photo of you that someone posted? That's really, really interesting to teenage girls. Boys too, but not quite as much. So the way you trap girls is information about social relationships. Girls have a much more developed map of social space. They want to keep it updated. Girls need to know who's in, who's out, who's central, who's friends with who's fighting with who. So social media traps girls. It lures them in. And once they're all in, they're trapped. Because now if you quit, you're ostracized. You're nobody. Everything's happening on Instagram. So you're nobody. So that's why we see girls' mental health plummets very, very suddenly in 2012. It's like someone flipped on a light switch. Their levels of anxiety and depression go way up. It's now normal. If you're an American teenage girl or British or Canadian or Australian.
Right. So this is a global phenomenon.
Yes, that's right. The developing world is different. That's a little different. When you go from no internet to having the internet, that might be actually good for you. But when you go from having the internet for 3 hours a day to having it for 12 hours a day, that is happening all over the developed world for kids. And that seems to be bad all over the developed world. Now, so girls, we can show the data is much clearer. Girls who are heavy users of social media are much more depressed. And there's also experiments showing it's not just a correlation, it's causation. For boys, the story is a little different. If you want to trap a boy, what do? Knowing what Tommy said about Roberto, it's kind of interesting, but it's not, how about, do you want to get together with some other boys and play war? Like you have guns and you form teams and you'll shoot each other. Like, wow, yes, sign me up for that. That is really exciting for boys. I remember when I was a kid, guns, toy guns, any sort of play war. It's so exciting.
It's quaint. Even growing up in the 80s, we had like a wooden gun that we found in the like a fake wooden gun.
I bought a BB gun at a church bazaar when I was like 10, and I just hid it in my closet. My mother never knew about it, and my friend and I, we'd take it out and we'd shoot things. We'd even shoot each other, which was really stupid, but we did. Anyway, so to trap boys, you want to offer them either fake war or naked people. So for straight boys, you want to show them naked girls. And then you say, hey, boys, do you want to see naked girls? Hell yeah, sign me up for that. Now, when you and I were young, I can't speak for you, but there was Playboy and there was some smuttier stuff.
Wait,
but there was no hard.
We had like one copy. It was like circulated among my group of friends.
Yep.
Like somebody kept it in their locker in school, and it's like, okay, you get it.
That's right. And you had to use your imagination, and it wasn't video.
Yeah.
And now it's incredibly high definition video, hardcore porn with a lot of anal sex, a lot of choking, a lot of really rough stuff. All kids are going to find this. All kids come across it. Imagine you're a 12-year-old girl, and this is your introduction to sex. Is it any surprise we're seeing more and more girls say they don't want to have sex with boys, they don't want to marry, they don't want to have kids? Anyway, back to boys. The thing with boys is they get trapped in video games and porn. They do that a lot. Well, if you're spending 4 or 5 hours a day on video games and porn, what are you not doing? You're not developing any skills that will render you fit either for employment or marriage. You're not learning how to talk to girls. You're not learning how to flirt. You're not learning how to court, how to seduce, how to kiss. You're being totally satisfied by a stream of incredibly sexy women getting, banged, as it were, forcefully. So until now, I've been saying the evidence is clear that it's harming girls. Girls are worse off because of social media. But as I'm working this out, what I'm realizing is that when you take boys and you don't let them develop into men, they're going to be boys for the rest of their lives. They're not finishing college as much as girls. Girls are crushing boys from kindergarten through PhD. Girls are crushing boys. Girls are finishing school, learning more, getting better jobs. Boys are more likely to become losers. They're going to spend more time in their family basement. A lot of them fail to launch. A lot of them live at home. Many of them never become productive. So if you look over the life course, actually, I'm beginning to realize in the long run, this is hurting boys a lot more than girls because it's really reducing their life prospects forever.
And it's coming at the same time against this cultural backdrop where boys are not being prioritized either.
Yep, that's right. Since the 90s, we had this incorrect idea in the 90s that girls were being left behind. It was not true in the 90s, and boy, is it not true today. We need to really look at what's going on with our boys. And so I'm friends and colleagues with Richard Reeves, who wrote a wonderful book called Of Boys and Men. And that book influenced me when I was writing my book. Richard talks about how boys began pulling out of the real world in the 70s. Before then, being physically strong opened up job prospects that were not open to women. Factory work, all kinds of jobs required physical strength. But as we move from a manufacturing economy to a service economy, well, girls and women actually have an advantage there. They're better at dealing with people. They don't get angry as easily, or at least they don't show it. So they're just better at service jobs. So girls begin rising and rising and rising. Boys are falling. And that's been going on since the 70s, Richard shows. And so, yes, of course, and around the world, girls have the worst of it. In most countries, girls are suffering more. But we've made a lot of progress towards gender equality in Western countries, and we've been totally blind to the way that our boys are just being ignored, left behind. They're so lonely. Our boys are so lonely because they're not out doing things. They're on video games and porn all day.
So at this point, all of this having a major impact, and especially in the data when it comes to girls and depression and suicide rates, et cetera. But what you're seeing increasingly is it's manifesting itself differently in boys, and maybe to the point where we haven't quite seen the effect of it all yet.
Well, yeah, actually, we've seen the effect. We're just kind of blind to it, as Richard points out. So boys' suicide rate has always been much higher than girls. Girls make more attempts. Girls think about suicide more. Girls are more prone to depression and anxiety and self-harm. But yet, when a girl makes a suicide attempt, it tends to be with a reversible method. It tends to be an overdose of pills or sometimes cutting their wrists. And the great majority of those suicide attempts don't lead to death. Boys when a boy decides to kill himself, he tends to use a gun or a tall building. Boys use irreversible means. So boys end up with a suicide rate that's 2 to 4 times higher, depending on the age and different things. But most suicide is boys and men, and it's up for boys and for girls. The percentage increase for girls is much higher, and this is true in many countries we've looked at. So life changed for girls more in the early 2000s than it did for boys, their move on to social media. But if we're just looking at the death toll, it's mostly boys. So and we've seen this, we just don't pay attention to it. Richard points out that the CDC, they'll publish all kinds of results, like look who's at more risk of suicide, and LGBT and Native Americans. They'll point out all kinds of groups that are higher risk. They don't mention boys. That's the biggest risk factor, is being male.
When you dive into the specific harms that some of this tech is causing, you talk about sleep deprivation, social deprivation, brain fragmentation, and addiction being sort of the four main
foundational
issues.
Yeah, it's not necessarily the 4 main issues per se. There are a lot of issues, but I present those in chapter 5 of the book as the 4 foundational harms, because I have a whole chapter on the girl story. I have a whole chapter on the boy story. But before I wrote those chapters, I wanted to lay out a phone-based childhood. When we go from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood, and most of your day is spent looking at a screen, what happens? And so the 4 foundational harms that are true for boys and girls, true for everyone, are sleep deprivation. And sleep is so important for mental health, for mood, for focus in school, therefore your grades, your relationships. So that's just a basic.
And it's uniquely important at this age, right? Because everyone talks about getting your sleep, even at our ages, but ultimately at this age, it's really, really key.
That's right. Because puberty is this period of rapid brain rewiring. And a lot of what goes on at night in REM sleep and deep sleep is it's like your brain is solidifying the connections of whatever happened that day. So if ever there was a time to really focus on your kid's sleep, it's actually puberty. Now, look, when they're 1, 2, 3, maybe that's just as important. I don't know. But certainly from age 12 to 16, those key years on the early side of puberty, those are more important than when you're in your 20s. So, so sleep deprivation is an obvious cost, and there's a lot of research showing this. Kids who play video games, or especially social media, at night, they're still thinking about it when they try to close their eyes. Or they take the phone under the blanket with them, they use it. So parents, please, you have to have a policy, all screens out of the bedroom by, 10 o'clock, 9:30, something like that. Because if there's a screen in the bedroom, some kids can handle it, but a lot can't. They're addicted and they will use it in bed. Second one is social deprivation. It's incredible to see the time use results where you look at how kids spend their time, and adults too. And the amount of time that adults spend with friends has only gone down a little bit since 2010. And then it went down substantially during COVID. We didn't see our friends as much. But for young people, they used to spend they spend more than 2 hours a day on average with their friends outside school. And that's normal. They were playing. But that begins to plummet after 2012, so much so that by 2019, it's almost all the way down to where the adults are. And then in 2020, when COVID restrictions come in, it goes down a little more, but not a lot more. In other words, American teens were already socially distanced by 2019. Once you give them a phone, it moves to the center of their life. They're communicating with their friends, but they're not seeing their friends. We're bodily, physical creatures. We need to be with our friends. We need to hug, touch, wrestle, exchange eye contact.
You need to be physically present. This comes up a lot in conversations, John. And, some parents will push back. My kid is talking to his friends all day, is playing video games virtually with his buddies, is, FaceTiming with their friends. Not the same.
That's right. It's not the same. So, when I was young, kids talked on the phone with their friends, especially girls. Girls spent a lot of time talking on the phone. A one-on-one phone conversation is great. That's fine. A FaceTime call is even better. So if it was just that young people are talking on FaceTime and that was pushing out a little bit of time with their friends, I'd say that's fine. But it's not mostly talking. Now, on video games, yes, they are actually talking and laughing, and that is good. This is why video games are not quite as harmful for boys as social media is for girls. Because in social media, it's not talking. It's posting, commenting on posts. There's a lot more anxiety. There's a lot less connection. Humans are ultra social creatures, much more so than dogs or chimpanzees. We really, really need to be in groups, and kids are focused on that. It's incredibly painful when they're excluded. If these technologies hooked our kids together so that they were more connected, then what we would have seen is that in 2012, all the indicators of mental health got better. When you radically change their lives and technology connects them, it should have gotten better. But that's not what happened. The technology actually disconnects them. They're connected in a nominal sense, but they're not really interacting in the way that mammals need to interact. And that's what we did. So I said the boys are so lonely. Girls are also, it's not quite as much, but the girls are also very lonely. All of our kids, not all. I mean, much more than previous generations. Gen Z is just very lonely. The other, like the saddest graph in the book, I think, is the one about, there's a question on one of the surveys. My life feels meaningless. And it used to be very low. Only about 10% of students agreed with that in the 70s and 80s and 90s. But all of a sudden, after 2012, that doubles. So you get something like 20% of boys and girls agreeing that their life feels meaningless. Again, if being hyper-connected in 2012 made your life better, you wouldn't see this. But that's not what happens. What happens is as soon as they all get online, they become lonely, depressed, anxious, and much more suicidal.
And then there's the other two, brain fragmentation and addiction harms.
Yeah, it's not brain fragment. It's attention fragmentation.
Sorry.
It's not that it's literally breaking apart their brain, but paying attention is very hard. And I certainly remember being bored in school. I remember watching the clock in some courses. And there were some courses that were great, that were I loved, and I wasn't bored. But it's a skill that you learn in puberty. It's based in the prefrontal cortex. It's called executive control. It's the ability to decide on a plan and then stick with it and deploy your attention appropriately. So if you want to write your homework, you're going to say, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to read this, I'm going to write an essay. So that's an essential skill that develops in puberty. It includes delay of gratification. Now, what if we said to kids, you know what? When you come into school, you can bring your television set, your walkie-talkies, you can bring your guitar, you can bring your painting supplies, bring it all. And you can use it during class. Oh, and when you're trying to do your homework at night, have all this stuff on your desk also. Whatever. And I don't know if people have seen that recent horrible iPad ad where Apple made this ridiculous ad. They take all of the musical instruments, painting supplies, everything. They crush it down. It's like, okay, you're admitting it. You're admitting that this is what you're doing. You're crushing creativity down, and so that everything goes through your screen. And that's what we did to kids. So the first iPhone was a Swiss Army knife. There was no App Store and there were no push notifications. But now, like my students at NYU, their lives are governed by the notifications. Constant. I mean, every 5 minutes at least.
Yeah, you were saying 250, the average person 250 times a day they're interrupted?
Yeah, that was what, there are various studies, but it's always between something like 200 to 300 times a day they're interrupted. How can you do anything if you're being constantly interrupted? And then each interruption, some of them are trivial, but some of them take you away for 30 minutes. Yeah. So if this is what our kids are growing up with, they have no chance to develop executive control. They don't get the practice in paying attention for 20 minutes straight. As soon as something is boring, they pull out their phones. And they say this, even at lunch. The NYU students tell me they'll be sitting at lunch with friends, and as soon as there's a lull in the conversation, one person will pull out their phone because she's got to check her notifications. She's got so much stuff coming in. And then once she pulls out her phone, then everyone else does too. And that's lunch. Yeah. So, it's an inhumane way to live. We need to live with each other, not with screens. As
this subject comes up, there'll be pushback. Typically, I'll hear from the left, like, of course kids are upset. Climate change is going on, oppression. They now have a war. They can follow wars in their pocket with video from the front lines. School shootings, etc., from the right, and you spent a chapter on this, and I find it very interesting on the lack of religion. I think the chapter is called "Spiritual Elevation and Degradation." Yep. Less and less people, and we've seen the numbers, right, involved in organized religion. You are an atheist, and I found it fascinating. You were able to look at the numbers on how this has impacted religious kids versus secular kids over the last decade. Not necessarily making a case saying everyone needs to go to church or whatever temple, but interestingly, explain that phenomenon.
So two things you said. One is, aren't they depressed because the world is depressing? Well, the world is really depressing now. I agree. And if all of this started in 2020, then I'd say, yeah, things really are bad now for a lot of reasons. But it didn't start in 2020. It started in Obama's second term. And guess who is worst off? It's liberal girls. Liberal girls are the ones whose mental health plummets. So were things so good in Obama's first term with the financial crisis that everyone was fine? And then all of a sudden, our first black president is reelected, the Supreme Court legalizes gay marriage, and this is when liberal girls suddenly fall off a cliff? It makes no sense. Also, if it was because of school shootings, and there was, the worst school shooting of all time was the Newtown massacre in 2012. So some people say, well, that's it. That's why it's 2012. And, a lot of kids have these lockdown drills. But why then did girls start checking into psychiatric wards in New Zealand at the same time, and Australia and the UK and Canada and Scandinavia? So the fact that this is global and that it hits girls more than boys everywhere, and that it starts in the early 2010s everywhere, means this is not about something that's happening in the world. Also, teenagers don't get depressed by what happens in the world at large. It doesn't touch them. It's all about their level of integration. It's about, are you connected? Do you have friends? If you're cut off, you're going to be depressed, even if it's the 90s and peace is breaking out all over the world and the stock market is booming and everything seems wonderful. Mental health is not related to the news. It's related to your local news, as it were, what's happening in your relationships. All right, so that's the first thing. Now, to continue on to your second point, we now have a lot of graphs about how the toll has been greatest on secular people as opposed to religious, on liberals as opposed to conservatives. And what we're now doing, what Zach and I, so I hope listeners will subscribe to our Substack, afterbabel.com. There's no paywall. You can get everything without paying. But we have a couple of posts in the last week about community. And this new research has really made us change our tune. I thought it was a tragedy in two acts, which is the loss of the play-based childhood in the 90s and 2000, the rise of the phone-based childhood, 2010 to 2015. But it turns out there's a third act, which comes first, which is the decline of community. So America had very, very high social capital, that is trust, a sense that institutions work well, a sense that, if my kid falls down on his bicycle a mile away, some adult is going to help him out and call me, take care of him. I remember
reading about this bowling alone.
Exactly.
These concepts in the 90s.
Yeah. That's right. So Robert Putnam has this great book, Bowling Alone, comes out in the year 2000. And it's about how America's always had very high levels of association. Alexis de Tocqueville observed this in the 1830s. He said, in Britain and France, if something needs doing, everyone waits for the king or the nobles to do it. But in America, they come together, they say, hey, we need a bridge. Okay, let's raise money. Who's going to lead it up? Americans are really good at forming associations to do things. And this gives you a good society where people can trust each other. And we had that. But it begins to decline in the 60s and 70s, and especially the 80s and 90s. And this turns out to be a key part of the story, because why did we lock our kids up? Why did we stop letting them out? It's not just because of the fear of abduction. It's because we stopped trusting our neighbors, and we felt, I have to supervise them all the time because I can't trust anyone else. So the loss of community is Act 1, and that leads to Act 2, which is the loss of the play-based childhood. Also, what we're finding now in these recent posts by Seth Kaplan and Zach Rausch at afterbabel.com is kids who are planted, especially in religious communities. So Seth Kaplan writes about how he chose to move into an Orthodox Jewish community. He's Jewish, but not Orthodox. But from what he could see, and he writes on social capital and trust, he said, I want to live in a place where people trust their neighbors and there are strong ties. And I need to find mental health data on Orthodox Jews. I don't have it. But my prediction would be that these Orthodox communities, while they seem repressive from the outside, and they might have been not so attractive before 2010, but those kids were so deeply rooted, they didn't get washed away the way secular kids. And of course, Orthodox Jews have Shabbat. They have literally a day a week when no one can use their phone. So, Orthodox Jews really have that advantage. And their kids, I believe, were not as harmed by the great rewiring of childhood.
But the solution isn't necessarily, and that's where I want to get at here as we conclude the conversation, that, we all need to be off our devices once a day, become Orthodox Jews, or start going to church again necessarily. You lay out, I think, a 4-part solution.
Yeah, so let me lay out the four norms, then I'll add the fifth, which is about community. So the 4 norms, because this is a collective action problem, because we're all trapped, we give our kids a phone because everyone else did. So it's easy to escape if we do it together. Here are the 4 norms. No smartphone before high school or age 14. Just give your kid a flip phone or a phone watch if you want to communicate with them, but don't give them the entire internet in their pocket all the time when they're 9 years old. So no smartphone before high school. The second is no social media before 16. Social media is wildly inappropriate for children. The sex, the violence, the manipulation, the strange men talking to them. Like, why? Why are we doing this at age 12? It makes no sense.
But Meta says it has parental restrictions now, John.
Oh, yeah.
There's a safe way to navigate.
Once you get into it, I mean, I don't know anybody who feels like, oh, yeah, it works great. Like, it's so hard to use these things, and your kids can get around this. So it's much better to just delay. No social media till 16. The third is phone-free schools, and this is happening fast. If you're listening to this podcast and your school allows your kid to keep a phone in his pocket, please complain to the principal or the head of school, because your kid, I can't guarantee you, but for a lot of the kids, they're texting during class, they're watching porn during class, they're shopping during class. There's just no reason that they should have phones during the school day. It needs to be locked up the whole day. And then the fourth norm, we didn't talk as much about this, the fourth norm is far more independence and free play in the real world. Because if we're going to take kids off of screens for most of age, especially around age 8 through 13, 14, if they're going to spend a lot less time on screens, they need to have each other. We need to give them an exciting childhood. And so if you can do this, if you can get together with a few other parents of your kids' friends, and you all agree, we're going to delay giving phones, we're not going to let them on Instagram or Snapchat or any of those until they're 16. But you know what? We're going to really work harder to help them get together. They can have sleepovers as often as they want. They can have a 5-way sleepover. It's really exciting. They can go from house to house when they're 9 years old. Let's let them walk. If you have a neighbor who lives a block away where there's another kid, let them walk around your neighborhood in groups. That's very safe physically, and it's exciting. When kids are on their own, they're excited. So we got to give kids back an exciting, real-world, social childhood. So those are the 4 norms I talk about in the book. And I'll just add the 5th one in response to your question. I might say everyone should become either an Orthodox Jew or an evangelical Christian, but I'm not saying that. That would give your kids some protection because they're anchored in community.
That would be especially surprising as an atheist, John. If you're recommending that. Yes.
Yeah, right. No, I'm a Jewish atheist. I'm not gonna. I could not imagine living in an Orthodox community. But what it means is that secular people who don't have built-in community, and liberals, because conservatives, morality is a little more binding. This is my book, The Righteous Mind, was all about this. Conservative families, it's more about binding obligations, duties, more punishment. So what I'm saying is that secular folks and liberal folks are going to have to be more intentional. You can't just join a church or synagogue, or maybe you should consider it, maybe, but you have to be much more intentional about giving your kids stable community. So if that means you have a group of relatives or friends with whom you try to get together every month, and you have a bunch of kids, because this is the great thing about Shabbat, the kids are all playing. There's no restriction on play. So the kids are all together playing on Shabbat. Find a group of families. Maybe it's your extended network of cousins if you're lucky enough to live near them. But find a way for your kids to get together over and over again with groups of people that are fairly stable. And this is hard to do in our modern atomizing, individualizing age. But you're just going to have to be more intentional about rooting your kids in real-world relationships, including with adults who are not you.
With return to this play-based childhood, the thing that I keep getting at, and I see it with how people, react to everything, including, lack of trust in media, lack of trust of government, lack of trust in everything. Yeah. There's pedophiles everywhere. It requires a level of trust in 2024 that I just don't see evident or present for
No, you're
people.
right.
And that's ultimately what you're calling on people to do things that require a level of trust that, we had in the pre being aware of everything era.
So, yes, you're right. I can't just say, let's pretend it's 1962, send your kids out and say, don't come home till the streetlights go on. You get out of here. Get out of here, you. I don't want to see you. We can't go back to that. That's true. But first of all, if you send your kid out, they're probably not going to find a pedophile because the pedophiles are all on Instagram. The pedophiles are not hanging out near playgrounds. The ones that did that have been arrested and locked away forever. They're on the sex offender registry. Okay, I'm not saying there's no risk. I'm just saying if your kid spends a lot of time on Instagram and other platforms, they are going to be conversing with people who are pedophiles.
The digital playground is more dangerous than the actual playground.
For the kids, whereas for the pedophiles, it's a lot safer. That's why they're all on digital. That's the first thing. The second thing is you have to be more intentional about it. So you can't just say, get out of here, go find other kids to play with, because there isn't a group of kids in the neighborhood that just goes out and meets up. But in some neighborhoods, you can create that. Not all. But so we talk in the book, so part 4 of the book with suggestions, Lenore Skenazy helped me to write that. She had a lot of great ideas. And one of them is, in your neighborhood, can you create a playborhood? This is a thing that was created by a guy named Mike Lanza, I think was his name, in Silicon Valley like 10 years ago. It's where you just get the parents to agree, you know what, they can come to our house. We have a swing set in the back. Some other family has a trampoline. The kids can go from house to house. They can come and go as they please. And maybe we'll just say, like, a simple thing that I suggest is, let's call it Free Play Fridays. On Friday, nobody schedules piano lessons. Nobody schedules Hebrew school, like whatever it is. Like Fridays, we all agree. The kids just get together and they play. Maybe if you'll feel better, maybe if you have 5 families doing this or 10 families doing it, maybe you rotate and one family is like on duty, like they're the one. Like, you start at my place, I check in with everybody. Now go out and have fun. If the kids are together, nobody's going to be abducted. I mean, they're going to look out for each other, and they have to learn to look out for each other. We have to let our kids practice being away from adult supervision. If you haven't let your kid be away from adult supervision, please don't send them to New York University. I don't want to teach them. Send me kids who have some independence. Send me some kids who've learned how to pay attention.
Is it too early to figure out how Alpha generation's doing post 2010 birth? Are they too young?
Yeah, it's too early. One thing that we don't know when Gen Alpha starts. The marketing people tell us it's 2011, but nobody knows. We won't know until we see how the kids are coming out.
Actually, how do these things get determined? I'm curious about that. Like, the demarcation point of millennials in 82 and Gen Z in 96. And
it's argued about a lot. It starts with marketing people, because they need to divide up the market into different segments. Jean Twenge, a collaborator of mine, she has a great book called Generations. She goes into great detail on how you do it, how the generations differ, because they do differ on average. And Twenge says it's based not on events. It's like World War II. Yes, that really mattered for my parents' generation. But television affects childhood massively. And then the move to social media. And now I think AI. AI hasn't changed our lives yet, but in 2 years it will. When kids are going to soon have lots of AI friends, this is going to be horrible.
Oh, God.
Lonely kids will just have AI friends, and then they won't learn how to, boys are going to have AI girlfriends. You can already have them. They're not, and these AI girlfriends are so sexy. You can customize them, make them flirty, make them intellectual, whatever you want.
If we thought the last decade was bad, the AI decade, I mean, I guess this speaks to the need for immediate regulation on some of this.
Exactly. That's one of the reasons why I feel a fire lit under me, is because AI is going to transform life within 2 or 3 years. And if we don't establish the principle now in 2024 that we need age gating, that the entire internet is not appropriate for our 9-year-old children or even our 11-year-old children, even our 14-year-old children, if we don't get age gating quickly, if we don't get an understanding that kids growing up on screens are coming out psychologically deformed, if we don't get to that point the next year or two, it's going to be too late once AI comes in.
I'm curious about one thing, what you've heard either behind the scenes or overtly, if there are names, from tech CEOs, from the powerful people who helped create this environment. What has been their reaction to your book, to the conversations over the course of the past couple months?
Yeah. So one CEO of a tech platform. So two of them have reached out to me. One is a platform I've said nothing about, and he wants to help. So I haven't talked to him yet. I'll be talking to him soon. Meta, I've spoken with Mark Zuckerberg on 2 occasions before 2020, but I've seen no comment from him about this. So Meta, I'm sure, I imagine they're having meetings about it. I mean, their PR department needs to be focused on this. But so far, they've certainly done nothing to, hurt me or even to argue against me. So I've seen nothing really from big tech yet. We'll see as more laws get passed, as norms begin to change. We'll see.
So ultimately, it falls on one of the more competent places, Washington, to make rules here, because the Silicon Valley ain't going to police themselves.
No, they're not going to police themselves. So I wrote the book on the assumption that we will not get any help from Congress. I wrote the book as a social psychologist saying we can break out of this collective action trap if we do it together. So the 4 norms that I said, none of them require government. Just don't give your kids smartphones until 14, no social media until 16, push your school to go phone free and give your kids more independence. We can do all those without any new laws. Now, the one place where laws would be transformative is raising the current age is 13. Once you turn 13, the law says, passed in 1998, you can give away your data, your rights, you can make deals with companies, you can sign terms of service, and you don't have to tell your parents. Your parents don't have to be involved. You're an adult. Oh, and you don't
How did they come up with 13?
Because Senator Markey, who was then Congressman Markey, he said 16, which I think is a reasonable age, because this was back in the days of AOL. At what age can a kid sign a contract with AOL? And so he thought 16, and I think that's right. And then the lobbyists for the tech and others, they pushed it down to 13 and they gutted enforcements. There's no enforcements. You don't have to be 13. You just have to be old enough to lie. If you're 7 and you're old enough to type and lie, you say you're 13, and then you can open an Instagram account, a TikTok account, whatever you want. So that is shameful. Congress not only created an environment in which there's no age gating, no age verification, no responsibility of the companies to check ages, but Congress also said, oh, we can't sue you. That's Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So is it any surprise that these giant companies, some of the most powerful companies in the world, are chewing up our kids and escaping responsibility? We have to change that.
Are you an optimist about
on
all
this
of this?
issue? I am. Yeah. On the kids issue, I am, because things are changing so fast, because everyone's sick of it. I mean, everyone. Most parents are sick of it. So I think we're going to see massive change within 1 year. That is, by this time next year, it's just going to be more common sense. It's not that there will still be a lot of 9-year-olds with iPhones, but it'll just be a general sense, just as we turned on cigarettes, as we're turning on junk food, and just there's a societal evolution where it just becomes common sense that, like, actually, no, it's not okay for your kid to just spend all day on video games. So on this, I'm incredibly optimistic. On the democracy stuff and the AI stuff, I'm more pessimistic, because these are huge, huge changes that I don't know what the answer is. I don't see clear solutions. I hope to write more about this. I hope to write my book, Life After Babel, and I'll make some suggestions. But I don't think I'm going to find 4 norms by which we restore democracy and then expect that they're going to happen.
John, thanks for this conversation. Thanks for the book. Congrats on all of its success. And I'm hoping that you get some more messages from some of the folks in Silicon Valley and Washington sometime soon.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Moshe. I hope your listeners will go to anxiousgeneration.com. We have so many resources there for parents, for teachers, for schools, also for legislators. So I hope that your listeners will take advantage of that. And I hope that they will see ways to engage in collective action. It's happening all over the country. Parents are coming together, taking collective action. That's the way we roll this back. That's the way we restore a play-based childhood. So thanks to you, Moshe, for getting the word out to an audience that, as I understand it, has a lot of parents in it.
A lot of parents, informed, politically informed, and always looking for interesting reads out there and ways that they can do more, both for their own families but also their communities.
Great. That's the solution right there.